following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
Even if you don't know what apps are gonna be built on top of blockchain or use blockchain, at least you know like this tool is, regardless what is being built, this is gonna be used. So like that's like when it comes to the graph or similar type of things that I would think of.
GRTiQ Podcast.
We're like astronauts, floating in the space of time.
Welcome to the GRTiQ Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Mable Jiang, Chief Revenue Officer at Find Satoshi Lab, a fast-growing Web3 product development studio with several well-known dapps, including STEPN, one of the most used dapps in the Solana ecosystem. In addition to her role at Find Satoshi Lab, Mable was also recently announced as a new member of the Graph Council, and the GRTiQ Podcast is fortunate to introduce listeners to Mable today, just weeks after introducing you to the other new council member, Julien Genestoux. During this interview, Mable talks about her unique background, which includes degrees in art history and statistics, when she first became aware of crypto and how she went to work in the industry, her time at Multicoin, and then we talk about the graph and joining the Graph Council. Along the way, Mable shares some incredible insights on Asia and the future of the industry in that part of the world. As always, we start the discussion talking about Mable's educational background.
So I went to school in the US. I went to school in the Columbia University in the city of New York for undergrad, and I only did undergrad for my educational background, obviously. My major was art history and statistics. So it was two very seemingly different majors, but that's really just like two areas of my interest. And I thought actually the kind of, the random choice or whatever go with heart was impacting me quite a lot afterwards in career, as well as like the way I think about things. So it was definitely a very fulfilling 4 years for me studying in New York, and then was able to do a bunch of internship and research, whatever, during this time of school.
Do you remember what drew your interest in studying art history? And it's not necessarily a GRTiQ first. I've had other guests that have actually studied art in their background as well. So I'd be curious what drew your interest.
So art and art history are different things. So art history is something that's more related to study the history, the sociology, all the politics and even economics related things during that period of time. So it's actually a full scan of, I should say, like the society of a certain period of time, because like a lot of things will be reflected from the work, as you can see. Like if you look at the Bruegel, it's a Dutch painter. Like he kind of depicts a lot of details in that like society, and then it was a perfect source of materials for people to understand. Like what about the 18th century Netherlands, right? That was just one example. So I think the interest really is about the fact that I was interested in a lot of the human aspect, the societal aspect of history. And then I wanted to learn from that. And I think one additional point that was interesting about our history is that you are learning from someone else's angle. It's not a macro angle. It's someone's eyes. You are seeing the world through their eyes. And I think that's like a very interesting kind of perspective. It shaped a lot of my way of thinking, in the future as well.
That's a very interesting answer, because I recently had James Hall on the podcast, and he's a UX designer over at Edge and Node, and he studied architecture, and he was talking about similar things about how architecture reflects the things that are happening in society at the time. And I wanted to ask you this question that I asked him, which is, do you think that's true for crypto and Web3? I mean, is the revolution or the advancement we're seeing when it comes to technology a reflection of something happening in society?
Very good question. You know what? I was not going to answer this with not just to focus on the tech itself. I think for crypto, what's interesting is that Like it's reflecting how the world has become democratized with information access. And that's exactly what this industry is about. Like people always kind of complain, quote unquote, complain about the siloed of information in this industry and then how decentralized all kinds of opinions and whatever people can get. Like there's never such thing called, well, maybe we'll have when we, with the help of large language models, but definitely right now, like we don't have enough aggregated centralized source of information that was impacting a lot of people's opinion about, the market itself. And obviously, I think, it's also interesting to see like how like all of these layer ones or some of the other smart contract platforms, they were doing a lot of grassroots type of effort to get more people into the ecosystem. And that's just like very different from how a lot of the large companies acquire partnerships and stuff. It's a lot of like bottom up things. So yeah, I understand that this is not a direct tech kind of perspective on answering those questions, but I would say yes.
Do you then see Web3 and everything happening with crypto as like a natural step in the evolution of what humans are doing with technology? Or do you see it as kind of this revolution against the sins of Web 2?
Yeah, so I think I was probably not exactly clear about like one point when I answered the previous question. What I was trying to say is that I think the certain, like you're basically taking off the intermediary in the society. And then a lot of people have direct access to information. They can use, the frictionless payment rail on crypto instead of like going through, I don't know, like Alipay or there's some other, a big platform for it to pay. All of those things are definitely reflecting, what we are going through, which is, I think, individual powers because of the empowerment of technology. Like you can do a lot of things on your own instead of with the group, with the large platform and this and that. And I think that's definitely very, very interesting.
So going back to your education, as you mentioned, you studied two divergent disciplines, statistics, art history. At the time, what did you plan to do with that education?
So, I mean, the thing is very simple, right? Like people, doesn't matter whether you're Asian or not, like you tend to think that, like STEM means like statistics, technology, engineering, and math can help you find a job or whatever. And then like the other part is just like for your own interest. But the reality is what stat and art history is quite similar is they both study a lot of aspect of something without drawing immediately to the conclusion. It's always about confidence interval. It's always about probability, like how likely this is getting to the closest possibly you could to the truth. It's not about 100%. This is like when you look at a bunch of evidence, like in, I don't know, like Athenian architecture, like in the past, like relics, there's no way that you can say like, I look at these 5 things and I just immediately draw a conclusion that this absolutely happened at that time. But you can say like, it's very likely something happened. So same thing for stat. So I answered this question from one of the interview, I think it was from BlackRock or something back in the days. Like they're like, why are you studying these 2 things and how are they related? I basically answered this and I still think so. That's why I said it shaped a lot of my way of thinking afterwards, just because I think it helped me really think about like, okay, if I'm drawing this conclusion, how confident I am, or can we get more close to the reality? And I think, that really helped in terms of, way I think. And obviously, when you are getting close enough, like you can also tell yourself, you can stop probing because it's marginally less beneficial.
Do you think, generally speaking, people don't appreciate or comprehend the nature of how probabilistic life is?
I think so. I would actually even say one thing that came to my mind. So a lot of people were complaining about how the world has become worse. And obviously, like, the past, especially for China, the past 30 years has been really, really great. Well, I mean, for US, not to mention, right? Like since last century, 1970s, all the way to like very recently, I think it's always going up. But people kind of like get too used to the fact that the world is always getting better without thinking about like in history, having consecutive 30 years or even 60 years of growth is just like never happened before. So like that's like a probabilistic thing. And oftentimes I think people should appreciate the fact that that just was magic happened. Well, I wasn't saying that, like, again, this is not anything about nihilistic or anything, but it's definitely something that with that kind of mindset, you can better appreciate all kinds of volatility in life.
You spent some time as a research assistant at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, so you were putting right to work your degree in art history. What was that experience like? And did you fall in love with it immediately and think, yes, I studied the right thing and I found my passion?
Good cue. I think what happened is that after doing the research, I knew exactly I could not work on anything that's like really business related to art because I felt like that's just tempting my kind of passion. I think my pursuit of art history or like anything academic was pure interest in the research itself rather than like using it, like selling it as like a real estate agent almost. That was just my opinion, not trying to like say which profession or whatever is good or bad. Like, so I wasn't able to really work in gallery or auction house because I felt like that's just like kind of a different type of thing when it comes to like researching art history or whatever. But going back to your question, that wasn't even like a summer intern. That was during the year. So I go to the Met, like the Upper East Side, every Thursday and Friday for the whole day. Because like that's a requirement, right? If you want to do it, like, you have to at least do it, I don't know, it was like 16 or 18 hours like in total per week. That was like the requirement. The work I did was also like quite simple. You know, it's just repetitive kind of work of transcription. You know, you transcribing a lot of the things written on the painting or works and put it in the database. And you look at a lot of the work directly, closely. And that was a really interesting experience because I think in art history, and also in a lot of things in life, is that you have to keep doing it many, many times. And then you just kind of like have it with you. You just intuitively know what is good work after you're seeing so many the good things. And then you do it again and again by going through it very in detail. Although the work itself is not as interesting, I'd say, for a lot of people. I enjoyed it a lot because I like looking at things closely. But I think realistically speaking, that was just like really good foundation training. And I think that's like something people would have to have. And, you know, not many people could have the opportunity to look at all the work in the, the inventory place closely. So that was definitely a very interesting experience.
Before we move on from your art history background, I do want to ask this question about what's your favorite time period if we look back historically on art and what people created?
Yeah, 19th century. Absolutely. 19th century. You know, like there's like a lot of interest. Sorry, I keep racking on this topic because like this definitely hit my interest. 19th century is the time where people first time interacted with the idea of modernity. The first time they interacted with a lot of technology that can improve our efficiency drastically in human life. And also like the notion of weekend, the notion of the capitalist, like you have work days and you have weekends, but that's actually the first time it came to people's mind, and also you enjoy leisure. You enjoy the quote unquote leisure and, you know, during the weekend, casual life, whatever, those kind of things. And then so you see a lot of artists like probing the relationship between human and tech. They probe the relationship of whether humans are objects of capitalism or are they really an integral part? Like, you know, what Marxist has been like discussing all the time, right? Like capitalist has been like exploiting people, whatever. So a lot of those very interesting notions were discussed very densely in 19th century art. Of course, like with a lot of the thinkers, the philosophers, they also do that. So like, you can see a very, very interesting period of time where like people, even like, you know, early 19th century all the way towards the end of it, you know, the thing that people were discussing are already very different. It's a really nice mirror of a very important transition period in human history. It's good to kind of see how people are reacting to it. And I think now we are getting back into the same kind of time in history. We are also facing a lot of new things. So I'd be curious to see, you know, what we would be getting in today's art world or like generally like creation world.
I appreciate the answer there. And I'm sure like many listeners, I'll be Googling 19th century art after this interview and learning more about that and looking for those themes. So after college, what did you do?
Yeah, so I started my first job at Citigroup doing institutional restructuring. I know it's like a relatively foreign concept, but you just kind of think of my actual day-to-day job as like doing valuation for different companies that were relatively distressed. So like those include, I guess, like gas, oil companies, and there's also like some casino and also solar related companies at that time, all related to the commodities related things. I learned a lot. Well, just primarily because I don't think I've ever done something as detailed like that. So like the valuation process really, really, I should say like painstaking because you have to, for example, if like an oil company you have to go into look at all the 100 rigs that they have and then, the differentiated types and then, giving some estimate on the drilling capacity, all of those based off like how much depreciation they have. So like those kind of thing, like I personally wouldn't say I'm the best at. I would say I'm very bad at those kind of things, but definitely trained myself to be more meticulous.
Was that a difficult move for you to make?
Yeah, so kind of like going back to what I said about I was positive that I don't want to work on auction house or gallery. Because like previously, what I thought was, okay, maybe I can work in the intersection of art and business. But then I realized that I would rather keep art at something of my lifelong hobby or interest rather than just treating it as an object. Sometimes like I'm a little bit idealistic in the sense, like I can talk about that, like why I joined crypto at kind of same thought. But I would say, yes, in terms of the skill set I have to pick up compared to my financial engineering colleagues who ever learned, operational research or FE, like those, it's definitely easy for people who study those. But it's not very hard. I think at Citi, the one of the most important live lesson that I grabbed was that what you learn in college or whatever may not matter at all. It's more about the methodology that you learned during the college. You learn how to learn. So that's a perfect kind of example of like, I think I got relatively well trained on how to learn, how to ask the questions. So like a lot of things can be just picked up during the work.
The GRTiQ Podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dapps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ. In order for a podcast like this one to succeed, you need to have two important ingredients. First, you need to have listeners that show up every week to hear the amazing stories and incredible work of the guests. And I'm grateful to say that thousands upon thousands of listeners have supported the GRTiQ podcast over the past 2 years, and I want to say thank you. The second ingredient you need is a way for new listeners to discover the podcast, and this is where we need your help. When a listener takes 5 minutes of their own time and leaves a 5-star rating and review wherever they download the GRTiQ podcast, the directory algorithm sees it as a vote toward displaying the podcast to people actively searching for more information about Web3, blockchain, and potentially the graph. If you're one of the listeners who've already left a rating and review, then please consider recommending today's episode on social media or with a friend. When listeners recommend an episode on social media, more people access the content and hear our guests' stories. And who knows, maybe your rating or review or sharing the episode on social media will be the thing that introduces the next indexer, delegator, or core dev team to the graph ecosystem. Thanks for listening.
Roger that.
So was it around this time at Citi that you first became aware of crypto and became interested in what was going on in that space?
2017, people started to trade, obviously, like on Coinbase back in the day. A lot of the colleagues were doing that. Sure, that was the first time I hear about it, right? I never had, because I went to school in the US and at that time, 2017, China was absolutely a booming market for crypto. A lot of projects came out of there. but I don't have any connection to those people. So the only source that I got was people who are trading in our office, right? Like, at their leisure time. Also, like in terms of equity market, we just can't trade much. So, crypto become another thing because like there's nothing that you have to disclose much at that time, right? Like just Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, whatever. But after that, 2018, and I went back, I didn't get my visa. So I went back to China. And then I started to make a lot of friends who were in that VC venture circle or like the tech circle. I got more dragged into the deep in the weeds of like, what it is about. It's not just about like the markets or money or whatever.
What were your first impressions of crypto? Did you think this was just a speculative asset?
I initially only thought of it as a asset. People trade it on Coinbase. That's it. Only after I started to get to know people and then started reading things myself, because at that time, like there's not much conferences anymore. I mean, there were conferences, but like I think people are still in the kind of information asymmetry in the sense that people who speak different languages, they won't be able to access others' information sources. But I think I had a relatively edge in terms of like being bilingual. I read a lot of either white papers or articles wrote by, USB at that time and a bunch of other, it's just like a lot of things that you can read on the internet at that time. And only since then, I started to develop my own worldview about what is Web3 or what is crypto. At that time, people don't call it Web3. It's just called crypto.
Do you remember the light bulb moment that you had where you did make that jump of like, oh, wow, there's a lot more going on here than I initially thought?
Absolutely. You know what? When that happened was when I watched Ready Player One. In that Oasis, quote unquote, metaverse, I started to think about the ownership of people's data. Like the biggest thing that it hit me when it comes to crypto is really about data sovereignty. I knew at that time, 2017, it was very hard to really get something that's 100% data sovereignty in a sense that no one can really own their data per se. Like things are, if you're putting data on chain, everyone can query it. Like it just doesn't make sense. But the idea that there's a chance that you can at some point allow people to earn and benefit from their own data instead of being used by the large company without paying you, that notion, that absolutely grabbed.
So in 2018, you make the move full time into the space and you go to work at Nirvana Capital. What's the backstory there?
Yeah, so the backstory was I got to know a lot of people in tech and venture world at that time, back in China. And then I was very keen to kind of learn about it. I was like, I just need to start somewhere. It doesn't matter where it is. Because I think I already realized that it was a forest where you can probe yourself, but you have to, again, right? You need to know how to learn. So where you start doesn't matter at all. It's more about like, what you study and who you talk to. You just have to be proactive. I remember back in 2018, I went to Silicon Valley. Well, I went to Bay Area, and then I just reached out to all the people from Compound, from Dharma, from DYDX. Like I met the co-founder now for Magic Eden, Roshan. He just joined DYDX the first week. He was the first non-engineering hire. Like you just talk to people like that. Like everyone was willing to talk to you. And then like all of these projects now, obviously, like they become very big. But then I didn't really have any concern about, like not joining a big firm, doesn't matter, whatever. I made immediate recognition about the fact that in this world, it's just about you being proactive and you try to learn a lot. And you have to also kind of write it all as well. So I got an intro from a friend and then, got this job at a family office. And that family office primarily does crypto. I was like, yeah, okay, this gives me a good position to start. So I will start here.
Did it feel like at the time you were experimenting with your career and maybe taking on some career risk? Or did this seem like you were jumping on the future and the opportunity to participate in something that could be really big for the world?
It's definitely a lot of risk. Everyone around me was like, what are you doing? Because like it's already over to the bubble exploded after peak of 2017, right? And I was working at Didi, which is the company that acquired Uber China, which is like relatively booming at that time. It's funny that people were saying like, afterwards, in the hindsight, it was the right move, but I didn't think of that anything. So I think people were just kind of like too obsessed with their credentials, like, Ivy League or whatever, investment bank or unicorn. But all of those things doesn't matter. I think what would go with you is really like what you learn, what you own yourself. So I didn't think of any of that. But yeah, like a lot of people were not understanding it. But I was trying to see, like, I'm still young. I can, spare 3 years. If all of these effort that I spent going into studying and researching it didn't work out, it's fine. I can still find a job. It's not a problem. I think I was relatively confident on how much space I would have, like in the back, like even if the worst thing happened, it's not going to be the worst. That's why I was like, yeah, let's do it.
So similar to my question, I asked you about going to work at the Met and applying your art history degree. When you went to work at Nirvana and started learning about crypto and had those first impressions of the industry and working in the industry, did you think, this is it? I found my home. This is definitely where I want to spend the rest of my career?
I would say so. It's interesting that you asked me. During that period of time, I didn't think of that. You'd be surprised. Like I was actually now thinking back. Sometimes I'm surprised by my own courage because in that family office, it's just myself. No one was teaching me anything. So I have 100% liberty to do anything I want to learn. I'm like a sponge, like absorbing whatever I can absorb. But I mean, after mid 2019, when I started to meet more people in the West, I think in 2019, I got to know a lot of people in the US, in Europe, or whatever. And I realized that, like over the past 2 years, it seems like I've already accumulated quite a bit of not only the connection, but also like the understanding insight because of the language, I guess, edge, that I realized that I truly brought myself into a world that can be extremely, extremely powerful. And then like since then, I just never thought of, I guess like it never crossed my mind at all in the past 6 years that I would leave this industry.
Where do you think that courage comes from, by the way? Is this something you were born with, or is this something you had to learn and build up to?
I don't think I learned it, or it's definitely not born. I'm a very conservative person, or like I'd say like I like to do things that I plan very, very much in detail. I like to, be repetitive in my work and then try to deliver something over a period of time after, putting the work in. But I think one thing was that because I was born like that, meaning I like to be working very hard every day, and then without seeing any result, that's fine for me too, even for a long period of time. So like I was almost like encouraged or convinced that for anything that I wanted to do, as long as I put in the effort enough, I would be able to do it. And I almost had now thinking of it's kind of like funny, but then I sometimes told people in the past that if you don't get something, it's just because you didn't work hard enough. But obviously it's not true. Like I said, it's all about probabilistic. A lot of the things in history happen because of luck. Because you are lucky, you are successful, not because like you're very good. Like I think a lot of people like would think they are very good. I mean, so like I definitely also went through that period of time. But for a long time, I also felt like if you work hard enough, you will definitely get something. So I think that was the reason.
Well, eventually you find yourself at Multicoin Capital, which a lot of listeners will recognize the name of Multicoin. And in fact, longtime listeners will know that I had Tushar from Multicoin on the podcast before. How did you make your way and eventually land at Multicoin?
So I met Kyle 2019 summer. I think he's been looking for someone in Asia for almost 4 months. Like he got a lot of people introducing him, all kinds of candidates. I think he just wants someone who speaks like, relatively fluent English and also can write or whatever, and then understand all the insights and the whole industry, as well as having all the connections on the ground. So his starting point was that he realized that there's such information asymmetry in this market that he thinks he should absolutely grab it. I think Multicoin was truly the first. I mean, sure, like there's a few other ones that they kind of claim that they connect East and West, but I think they were the first American firm that started American and tried to, build a strong presence in Asia. And I think I should confidently say that after 3 years there, I think Multicoin is absolutely, absolutely almost one of the best, most known venture firm in Asia. But yeah, going back to your question. So I was always very obsessed with this idea. Like I said, I realized that there's also like this information asymmetry in this industry. So I was obsessed with building a brand that can connect East and West. So I was already doing a lot of those when I was in Nirvana. I was writing a lot of the English posts, whatever, and also like tweeting a little bit, not a lot at that time. I didn't realize the power of Twitter until I get to Multicoin, but I definitely did a little bit of those. Primarily just because I realized that, a lot of the information that people were talking about, the trends that are popping out in New York and Bay Area, no one knows in China and vice versa. A lot of interesting, the mining ecosystem, or there's a few other things like people talk about in Asia, no one talked about it in the West. So I was always obsessed with that. We talked about, after we met up, we talked about this. And I think that was the major reason I wanted to join Multicoin, because I realized that these are the people who I can definitely be partnering with, with them being in the US, myself being in Asia, to build what I wanted to build.
So talk about what you did at Multicoin and some of the projects you worked on.
Yeah. So when I joined Multicoin was it's still a very small firm in terms of number of people. So at that time, it's also that, right? Like, so we do whatever we need to do. I think all of us were hustlers. Like we just try to do whatever we can to build, like grow the firm and grow awareness, and also getting the deals, and also like letting people know about what we think. We're very public about a lot of our opinion, and that obviously we're not favored by everyone, but I still think it is the right way of doing it. It's only that you get feedback, right? Of course, like some people won't like it, but the best projects would also reach out to you and know about you. So my job kind of like ranging from obviously deal sourcing, investing, like doing the analytics for the project itself on the venture side. I do touch the secondary as well. Like we don't really separate. That was just kind of the nature of the business at that time. And then we also do portfolio management and support, meaning we work for our portfolio, trying whatever we could do to help them be successful. And I also did fundraising. So I think it's like every single aspect of the company. Well, other than like financial auditing, obviously, I've touched upon, because like at that time, there's no one else with myself in Asia. I just have to do everything. But I also enjoy that because I think it gives me a lot of different perspectives of the business, from finding the LP side of things. Like what do you tell them? How do you not like kind of just inundate them with too much information? And what do you want to show to the founders? Like, how do you get the best, founders to talk to you? And also obviously, like, going through all the information sources and finding the right move for secondary market. So every part of that I was able to touch. So I thought it was interesting.
Well, as listeners will know, Multicoin is, a Goliath within the industry. And that must have offered you an incredible perspective of the industry. And if we look back on your story, it began at Citi and seeing colleagues speculate on this new asset. Then you had this aha experience on your own research where you recognized there was something bigger going on. And now you're working at one of the biggest VCs in the industry, and you're building out everything they're doing in Asia. What did you learn about the industry at this time, and how did it evolve your thinking?
I think the time I joined was a perfect time for us to really build close relation and connect the dots between East and West. Because like right after 2019 that I joined in 2020, I think a lot of things happened, and then things starting to take off, right? I think the graph also took off around 2020 and 2021 because of the DeFi summer, thanks to that. So I think one of the biggest observation, or I'd say like my personal experience, was that, say Solana or a bunch of other very large projects, which are also like big portfolios of Multicoin, even including the graph, right? Because I was in Asia, so I recruited the employees for these companies. So like one of the person who's working at Edge and Node right now, like I interview her and then help Tegan hire her or whatever. And then same thing for Solana. I kind of like identify the first few employees for Solana Labs at that time. So a lot of those, I think definitely, was showing one thing about the globalization of that time. Like people need to be globally present in terms of growing the projects and finding the developers and this and that. I think that was like one of the biggest thing that I wouldn't say I only discovered after that, but definitely something I experienced through. And then it convince me that, the thesis that I joined Multicoin was absolutely correct. Like bridging East and West is truly important. And that comes to awareness, that comes to BD, and also the way you market, how information structure, we like to use this word in Multicoin, looks like, lays out in that specific region. And you have to have the people on the ground to do that.
What do you make of the criticism that VC firms like Multicoin receive in the industry, whereby because of their participation, they introduce centralization risk because maybe they fund a project and they get a bunch of the tokens and they've centralized it? I mean, how do you respond to that type of criticism or stereotype of VCs?
So I think, first of all, people have the interesting perception about VC is like, well, there's like a few stages, right? I think the type of VC that takes very active participation in a network is actually the ones that should be respected and even be thanked. Because I think a lot of the companies would either just want to put some money in and just lie there and do nothing. That's even worse, I think, because they get the stake, but they don't work on it. So like that's like interest misalignment. Going back to your question, I think everything before it starts to go into a flywheel, there needs to be a force to be pushed. And where does that force come from? It has to be one or two big players. Just like at the beginning when Solana was, well, not hated, but definitely not favored by the ETH fans. But after SBF started to talk about it, people started to change their mind. Not about like Solana itself changing anything, but rather it's just that it introduced a bunch of neutrality to other people's minds. Like, oh, Sam started looking at it. Maybe I should look into it. That's just like a change of perspective. And I think similarly, when a lot of people do not know about a project, but then a large VC firm went into it and started to promote it and, even talk about what it can do, like how bright the future can be, that just introduces a lot more exposure to that thing. And you can even argue the other way that because more people, more grassroots know about it, then it actually introduces more decentralization because you have a broader base for the foundation of the consensus.
I want to ask you two questions about the bridge you built into Asia at Multicoin. But the first question is, you talked about information structuring, kind of a strategy you would use at Multicoin. What do you mean by information would need to be structured differently?
Not to be structured differently, but it's rather structured, like it lies at different channels and vehicles in a different region. So like the way people get their information in crypto, say, so back in the days in China, right? Like people use WeChat. It's not open net there. And then people don't like to use Twitter. I think a lot of other things, like how the media here work, right? Like how you develop a relationship versus like in the West, like you just go through like a formal embargo process. Like all of those details are things, how information flows, that would matter a lot when it comes to a project wants to think about its go-to-market strategy in a different country, in different region. Even like I think how Southeast Asian market work is very different from the East Asian market. I wouldn't say I know the Southeast Asian market very well, just because I don't have enough information about how information flows. And I think understanding how information flows would help a lot when it comes to getting true adoption for a project, or like getting developers understanding, like starting to learn about it.
And the second question I want to ask is, what do you think the West is getting wrong about the East when it comes to the future of this industry and the adoption of crypto?
I think one thing about it, I wouldn't say it's getting wrong, but I think people have this stereotype of Asian teams are only better building applications versus anything that's protocol level or a more like infrastructure level should always go after the European and American teams. I think I understand where that comes from because in historical stats, it is true that way. But I think there's also reasons because a lot of the Asian teams, they just don't speak good English. And all the, relatively powerful VC firms are in the West. So then like you don't have, like, again, right? Like you just don't get to go into all of the important information sources and vehicles when it comes to like finding the people who can actually truly impact the market opinion or developer opinion. But I think this is definitely if not 100%, at least it's something that can be slightly tweaked. I think people should still be open-minded when it comes to like, oh, like what kind of founder should I be looking for when it comes to different type of projects? I think at the end, it's all about whether this person is a hustler, whether this person would try to do whatever they want to do. And then obviously language barrier, it is a true thing. It is a real thing, but it's case by case. I don't think region or race or ethnicity matters in that sense.
Well, Mable, you and I are speaking today because it was recently announced that you're a new member of the Graph Council, and I was fortunate enough to interview Julien, who is also a new member, and listeners will know that I interviewed Chris Wessels a long time ago, who was also announced as a new council member. I want to talk to you about when you first became aware of the Graph, and I have to assume it was probably during your time at Multicoin, but can you take us back in time and tell us when you first became aware of the Graph and what some of your original impressions were of what the protocol was doing?
So I know about the Graph actually even before that, just because I think back in the days, all the earliest DeFi project used the Graph, right? I remember, I think the website at that time were even like featuring Compound, Uniswap as well, and some of the other ones. Because at that time, there weren't that many DeFi protocol anyway. Like Curve wasn't even around. And then I joined Multicoin. I learned about a story how like Kyle kind of flew in to Bay Area multiple times. And then at that time, because Yaniv, like he's a tech founder. Maybe not all the VC would understand that. And obviously people don't see the future of DeFi at that time. So definitely a relatively harder thing to fundraise in a bear market. So that's like what I learned about it.
And when you think back to those first impressions of the Graph, what was your observations about the importance or the nature of the problem the Graph was trying to solve?
So it's actually as simple as blockchain is decentralized ledger. There's naturally going to be a lot of information, stats or whatever being stored, like data on top. So you then really just need an indexer and something that you can sort out all the how the information were arranged and placed and displayed and this and that. So one article that really impacted me quite a bit it's one article by USB that wrote about different phases of protocols and applications in history. And really the idea is that like if you have a platform full of information, the next natural thing you should think about is about how you sort and curate those information. It's as simple as that. So I think going back to the history of the internet, like you are seeing a lot of these different apps like being built on top. But at the end, is really how you are using human information and all kinds of data being stored on the open web, and then like curate them and to allow those information to be more easily consumed and accessed by users. So something like the Graph at that time, when nobody can imagine what people can be doing with blockchain, that just become absolutely important because I think Kyle like to use a very first principle way of thinking, which is even if you don't know what apps are going to be built on top of blockchain or use blockchain, at least you know like this tool is, regardless what is being built, this is going to be used. So like that's like when it comes to the Graph or similar type of things that I would think of. This is absolutely going to be the layer that people would need to use, the indexing layer. But who's going to be building it? Whoever the first may just have the most mind share. And I think that is Graph right now.
Mabel, we haven't talked about what you're presently working on, and we'll do that in a minute, but you're clearly very busy, and you just took on this role of joining the Graph Council. What was it that compelled you to take on that additional responsibility and begin working on the council?
I think earlier I mentioned that I introduced one of the Asian hire to the Graph. So I always had a really amicable relationship with people who were, from the foundation and also from Edge and Node, obviously, one of the more important player in the ecosystem. And then I think when they were looking for someone additional to join the council, I think one part that it hit me was that the Graph was truly thinking about adoption and go to market. I think for a period of time, there's definitely a lot more focus on the protocol level itself, on the developer community. But I think, once you build the protocol, you need to kind of think about the application layer, and you kind of need to think about adoption. So I think the rest of the council thought I could probably bring in a little bit different perspective compared to some of the other players in the council. And also, the fact that I was a Multicoin, Multicoin was one of the larger investor of the graph at, early stage. So there are just like a lot of like very close relationships. So I think they felt comfortable that I can provide a relatively interesting value that could be slightly more differentiating. And then I thought, because I feel closely, I can contribute a little bit. I would love to see the graph going further.
In the brief time that you've been on the council, you must have learned some new things about the graph community, the ecosystem, or the protocol itself. What are some of the things you've learned that has excited you about the potential of the graph?
I think people who are following a lot of the upgrade closely probably would be able to speak much better. So I won't go into those details, but the fact that I think the whole development community was thinking about the priorities of different chains, and also, going to different EVMs and discussing like which one is the priority is like a true example of thinking about adoption and actual use. Because like when you are doing those prioritization, obviously you are thinking about like what are some of the developer activities or user activities on top of each chain, right? Like Arbitrum, or there's some of the other ones. So I thought those were interesting. And there was constant debate about whether certain notions should be prioritized, whether that being like, decentralization or monetization and those. And I think, those conversations, obviously, I don't have to share, but I think it's definitely good conversations to have for any protocol projects that are working in this industry. Because I think at some point, we always need the interest alignment when it comes to, can this protocol to be robust for a longer period of time so that like it, it's not losing money. It can actually self-sustainable, right? So things like that, I think that's something that I was excited about the graph community started to think about and then truly pay attention to.
Hi, this is Mable Jiang from Find Satoshi Lab. If my conversation with the GRTiQ Podcast has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting future episodes by becoming a subscriber. Visit grtiq.com/podcast for more information. That's grtiq.com/podcast for
GRTiQ Podcast.
Thanks for listening.
Roger that.
Well, as I mentioned, your full-time work is now at Find Satoshi Labs, and you're the Chief Revenue Officer at STEPN. What can you tell listeners about the work you're doing there and the relationship, by the way, between those two entities?
Yeah, so STEPN that doesn't have an entity. It just Find Satoshi Lab. It's the studio behind STEPN. We have a few other products, one of them being a non-custodial NFT marketplace, and there's a few other things that's like very exciting that we are building. But my role is the Chief Revenue Officer of Find Satoshi Lab. And then STEPN is just the first flagship product that we built. In a nutshell, what STEPN is, if you're describing to a 5-year-old or like, completely non-crypto native people, is just like a fitness app that help you move, incentivize you move with certain rewards. That's it. Like we don't want to expand too much on, the fancy stuff like you can do. But I think a truly interesting Web3 app or that can get mass adoption should be easy for people to understand in one sentence, right? So for us, like really the mission and vision partially is to help people adopt a better, healthier lifestyle. And the way we did it through leveraging crypto is to have more incentive alignment through the design. That's what we are growing when it comes to STEPN. But yeah, for Find Satoshi Lab, I did mention there's a few other products.
And STEPN's one of the largest or most used apps in the Solana ecosystem. Do I have that right?
That's correct. So we are actually on multiple chains, but our major population are still on Solana.
I don't know if a lot of listeners of the GRTiQ podcast are familiar with everything that's going on in the Solana ecosystem, but if you don't mind, what can you share about your experience and observations about what's going on over at Solana?
Right. It's definitely a very interesting period of time. I think one interesting story is that I also sit on Solana Foundation. So since the very beginning, 2020. So I think one thing that I felt like they did very well compared to many other layer ones or smart contract platform is that they build very organic developer community. They run very good hackathons. And then the quality of submission, I think primarily because their lineup for the post-hackathon support was just incomparable. So all the ones that won prizes were absolutely, truly quality projects. So even for Multicoin back in the days, we always source the projects from the hackathon. So I think that was the bread and butter of Solana. Obviously, I think they had a relatively good job when it comes to BD, but I think Polygon is very good at BD too, right? I would say like they're even better. But I think like Solana, when it comes to the growth, a lot of those were driven from the active, organically growth developer community. And then I think like the NFT side somehow was also quite vibrant. And I think that was definitely thanks to Magic Eden. They, spent a lot of time making sure that the user experience was great for a lot of the NFT lovers. So they built out this marketplace, and from there it truly grew a lot of very interesting NFT projects as well. And then another one was obviously Phantom, which is like the previous, I think, 0x team, like back in Bay Area. And they also, because they built Phantom Wallet with a very, very smooth and sleek user experience, a lot of people started to use Solana back in 2021. So I think a lot of those are definitely worthwhile mentioning milestones.
Well, I only have a few more questions for you before I ask you the GRTiQ 10. The first one is, if we were to put all your skills and experience of go-to-market strategy, growth and bridging the East and the West, capital markets, investing, all of it, what would be your observations or priorities for the industry over the next, call it 5 to 10 years? What are the most important priorities or mileposts that you're paying attention to?
Yeah, I would say, so kind of building on top of all the skills that you just mentioned, I think being able to understand how, from first principle, how the tech work is very important. But what's more important is how to leverage the certain type of tech to be working in the real world. I do think right now we have built out a lot of interesting infrastructure, or like some of the problem that people imagine will be. But I think what's more important is that you need to really bring audiences to use and test out whether something is actually needed or not. So I think all of those that we were mentioning, I think investing is not a skill set. I think identifying the opportunity that still needs to be fulfilled is the skill set. And that comes with the ability to understanding the information asymmetry and understanding information structures in different places, and try to fill those holes and find the still unfulfilled holes for different projects and companies to be delivering a lot of those work. So I think that's like where we really need. And I think like in order to get to that phase, the projects should probably, at least from my perspective, if I were to angel anything or whatever, is really thinking about what problem do I need to solve, rather than what kind of thing that could be interesting that falls into one of the Web3 subsector bucket that I wanted to build. And then think about that problem and think what tech I need to leverage to get to that point. So it's more of a first principle way of building rather than just building on, different tracks of the industry. I think that's absolutely the most important thing.
And then the second question is your foray into crypto. The conviction was learn something and find out what's going on here. You self-educated and you went to work in the industry. What's your conviction now? If it's not to continue to educate yourself or learn more, it must be something else. What is it?
Yeah, no, I think I wasn't saying that I was trying to educate myself a little bit more. I was saying that I think I was obsessed about data sovereignty. And although I know there's very low chance at that time to be solved, like that problem, because a lot of the thing is just not there. Like even if you can store the data on chain, whatever, it's like everyone can still access it. So like it doesn't really make sense at that time. But I know there's the fact that people could actually be more aligned when it comes to the contribution they do. So I think it's more than just like the data sovereignty piece, to be honest. I think I would like to maybe now expand it to what people have contributed to certain thing, and then how blockchain infrastructure can really empower and help them to easily get their reward, through like leveraging the smart contract execution, right? Like now you have account system, and then it's all like very simple notion. It's nothing really complicated, right? You work on something and then you want to make sure that, if this thing you delivered, you got your fair piece. And then like you threw a curve, not curve 5, but like through a curve you design, and then you make sure at different period of time, different types of contributor get the amount that they should be getting based off like the time differences and when you started to contribute. And all of those things, I think that's the most important, because at the end of the day, I think blockchain, what it really does, it's lower a lot of the friction when it comes to human labor distribution. You wanted to make sure that when this whole world is going into a granularization of human labors, like a lot of people are no longer on the 9 to 5 payroll. So like if we are already entering into that phase, then how do you correspondingly leverage blockchain to help them get to that phase where people can be paid with certain small chunk of things with their granular work? So I think that's what I felt now.
And the final question I want to ask you is about sentiment and interest in crypto in Asia. As you look back over your career from when you went to work there to present, what's the trend? What are you seeing?
I think there's like two phases that like changed quite a bit. I think before 2018 or even 2019, I think a lot of projects were building there, but I would say like it's interesting to see a lot of the founders. They started off their team in Asia and then they went raising in the West, but they tried to find the speculators in Asia. And that was definitely the Wild West period of time. 2020 all the way 2022, I think that's like when US regulators were relatively friendly. So I think a lot of the emphasis goes there. So like the builders are there, hackathons are there, investors are there. Now with the recent change of the regulation, I think there's an interesting move of like re-emphasis back to Asia. And I think what's different between this period versus like the first period was that a lot of these people now started really think about building. People who are doing these work now are the Tencent people or ex-Alibaba people, or like all them, like the people who are relatively well trained and have a relatively nice career path, if you may say. And then these people, because obviously like, they're probably not seeing too much hope or whatever, continue doing things in a large company, or like maybe they just want to embrace this whole Web3 trend, they came in. So now I actually think it's not just about people starting to try to raise from the West and then like doing something that they imagine can be working. Now it's actually a bunch of engineers who were well trained and identify certain problems they want to solve with the blockchain technology. And I think there is a chance that they don't have to emphasize that much on the investor from the West. They can, if they raise something, that's good. But then if they could monetize for themselves without raising that much, that's also another option. So I think there's like such change definitely I observed.
Well, Mabel, now we've reached a point in the podcast where I'm going to ask you the GRTiQ 10. These are 10 questions I ask each guest of the podcast every week. And it's a way to kind of let listeners get to know the human side of each guest and some of their interests, as well as to learn something new, try something different, or achieve more with their own life. So are you ready for the GRTiQ 10?
Yep.
The GRTiQ 10.
This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
Roger that.
What book or article has had the greatest impact on your life?
3, if I may. First one is 3 Body Problem. The second one was The Crisis by Ray Dalio, the one that he wrote in 2020. Absolutely impacted me quite a bit when it comes to not just investing, but generally about the world. Third is Diamond Sutra. I meditate a lot, and I think that was one book that helped me with a lot of how I think of all the volatility in life.
Is there a movie or a TV show that you would recommend everybody should watch?
I think Blade Runner 2019 and 2049. Was it 2019? Like the first one, I forgot, but like the series.
If you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
Honestly, this is a really hard one. I think Hans Zimmer's album, the ones that he created for all the movies.
What's the best advice someone's ever given to you?
Just follow your heart and actually do. This is like very cliche, but truly follow how you feel instead of how other people feel, because you only live for yourself.
What's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people have learned or know quite yet?
A lot of time it's about repetition. I think I mentioned this as one of the thing earlier I talked about. But there's no secret sauce or anything. Like a lot of the time, as long as you repeat enough, you would probably get it.
What's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
Intermittent fasting.
Based on your own life experiences and observations, what's the one habit or characteristic that you think best explains how or why people find success in life?
People always focus on their own problem, who do not try to source problem from the external world.
And then the final 3 questions are complete the sentence type questions. The first one, Mable, is the thing that most excites me about the future of Web3 is?
Data sovereignty.
And the second, if you're on Twitter, then you should be following
STEPN official.
And lastly, I'm happiest when
I can provide value and empower other people.
The GRTiQ 10.
After this, I show you how deep the
Podcast.
Mable Jiang, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. You've been very generous with your time, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you, and I know listeners will as well. And as many members of the community will be watching the Graph Council and certainly interested in the work and the contributions you'll be making there. If listeners want to stay in touch with you and follow things you're working on, what's the best way to stay in touch?
Twitter is Mable_Jiang.
This has been a production of the GRTiQ Podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review. GRTiQ Podcast. Roger that.